Havel havalim, amar Qohelet. Havel havalim, hakol havel. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. With these existential words, we jump today into the fascinating book of Qohelet, otherwise known as Ecclesiastes. So from the intense suffering and anguish of Job, who lost everything and was afflicted by severe physical illness, we move to another type of suffering, perhaps one that is more characteristic of our own age of skepticism, our age of boredom, and that is this existential angst of not really knowing exactly why we live, when everything seems vanity, when nothing really seems to make sense sometimes. And so as this picture, we may look at ourselves in the mirror and realize that everything we do, all of our endeavors, are indeed a vanity as we really stare at death in the face. So before we study, why don't we begin with a meditation on Ecclesiastes chapter 1 as a type of meditation and prayer on these words, really questioning everything about human existence and seeking a meaning through these words of the preacher of Qohelet. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. So in our study of Qohelet, or Ecclesiastes, we continue to follow the book by Peter Kreeft, Three Philosophies of Life, and we said when we studied Job that for Qohelet or Ecclesiastes, this book reflects life as vanity. In other words, a great mood of boredom that eventually points to hell, to the absence of God, or at least the separation from God. And this book really teaches us faith, that without faith, we are essentially lost. We are without a compass, a theological compass, a moral compass, and basically a life compass to help us through this human existence. We've already studied life as suffering, as seen in the book of Job, and next time we will see life as love, as seen in the Song of Songs. So what kind of a book is the book of Qohelet? Is it a book of theology or a philosophy? Well, this book says nothing about Israel's tradition like most early wisdom books. It is very much a monologue and not a dialogue, so God is totally silent in this book. Even though the author refers to God many times, he never actually speaks to God, neither do we hear any response coming from God. But God is mentioned 40 times in the book. He is mentioned, however, always by the term Elohim, the generic word for God, and never as Yahweh, as the covenant God, the Lord, which perhaps expresses this state of existential separation from God that we sense within the book. So is it then a book of philosophy or theology? Well, it does speak about God, but in a way that is very skeptical, and so many have said really this is more a philosophical work than a theological work. So if a book of philosophy, what kind of philosophy? Scholars have proposed skepticism, pessimism, Stoicism, or Epicureanism. Skepticism we see very much on every line, this deep doubt at whether God is really there, whether he is truly present, whether he truly cares, whether happiness is really attainable in this life. And it seems like it's not attainable according to our author, thus the pessimism, and also thus the Stoicism. Therefore, what should we do? Basically, avoid emotions and just avoid suffering as much as we can as we live a life of detachment from all pleasures in this life. Or perhaps the solution is the opposite, that of Epicureanism. Let's make the best of this life as much as we can, and so enjoy this life to the greatest of our ability for the little time that we have. So some have seen traces of all four of these philosophies in the book of Qohelet or Ecclesiastes. In any case, Ecclesiastes is a book that is profoundly about ethics. It poses the most important question of ethical questions, that of the summum bonum, the highest good. Now, Kraft reminds us, appealing to C.S. Lewis, or referring to C.S. Lewis, that ancient ethics always dealt with three questions, having to do with three things a fleet of ships is told by its sailing orders. So if you're going to have a fleet of ship, what are the three questions that you need to ask about this fleet? Well, first, the ships must know how to avoid bumping into each other. And this, for C.S. Lewis and for Kraft, would represent social ethics. Okay, you have the ships on the sea, the fleet of ships. You have to make sure that none bump into each other, none collide with one another so that they stay afloat and that they are able to navigate really as a fleet. So this would represent social ethics, how we as people are able to navigate through life, so to speak, and avoid collisions with others and have a good social order among ourselves. This is very much at the center of what we might call modern philosophy today, the social ethics. But second, our ships must also know how to stay shipworthy and avoid sinking on their own. So if a ship is full of holes, it doesn't really matter what you do to avoid colliding with others, it's going to sink. Now this, for C.S. Lewis and for Kraft, refer to individual ethics, virtues and vices, character building. And so we as people must know how to stay afloat on our own, even before we encounter relationships with others. Third, our ships must know why the fleet is at sea in the first place. Is the fleet of ships at sea just to avoid colliding with one another and to stay afloat? Well, no, they probably have some goal of reaching some far distant land or perhaps going to war against some enemy fleet. So there has to be an actual purpose for the fleet of ships to be on the sea. And that is what we would call the summum bonum, the reason for our existence. So likewise, we do not only exist in order to avoid conflicts with one another, we don't only exist in order to not completely collapse and die. We have to have individual ethics for sure, but we must also know why we're alive and what is the point of our life. And this is what Ecclesiastes struggles to find throughout the book. Therefore, Ecclesiastes is truly an existentialist. He is not sure why he exists. And according to Kraft, this first existentialist was Solomon, King Solomon, if we go with the traditional authorship of the book. Kraft says that Ecclesiastes is the first and necessary step towards salvation for the modern world. So Kraft sees this book as a very modern book because it raises all kinds of questions that are very modern questions. And in order for us to find the answer, that is the answer found in God's salvation, we first need to know how to ask the right questions. And this is what we set out to do. So how is Ecclesiastes a thoroughly modern book? Peter Kraft proposes 7 ways by which Ecclesiastes is a modern book. He says, to begin with, it's an existential book. It's about human existence. Does my existence here have any meaning at all? And this is certainly a question of our times. In this age of relative prosperity and of wealth, at least for us in the West, we must ask ourselves, does all this still make any sense? Second, Ecclesiastes shows modernity's greatest fear, meaninglessness. And so despite our comforts and our wealth and our prosperity, is there still a meaning to all of that? So it's the question of Qohelet, and it's the question of many of us even today. Qohelet is a deeply honest book. It's a type of honest despair, to be honest. So this, too, we find in our age, we find perhaps a lot of despair, but hopefully a certain honesty in trying to figure out what all of this is about. Ecclesiastes provides answer. What kind of answer does it give us to the question of the summum bonum? It provides no answer. And this, unfortunately, has been the the answer, or is the answer, for many people of our own generation who have given up on finding a summum bonum, an ultimate good for our lives. What then is the practical result of this lack of a summum bonum? Well, let's just enjoy the day as much as we can. Follow your passions, hedonism, do whatever is pleasurable, whatever is pleasant. Does this make us happy? That's another question. The context of Qohelet is a secularized world. So even though our author does believe in God and mentions God many times, we still see a type of compartmentalized religion, whereas God is really put in a box and he's not really present in every aspect of our life, including the one that gives us happiness and joy. That too is very typical of our modern secularized world. Number 7, the method and epistemology of Qohelet is thoroughly secular. How do you know the truth? Many today don't even try to refer to God. They try to find answers to this question on their own in a secular way. So how then should we answer, or perhaps how should we avoid the question of the summum bonum? Since this question is very much at the forefront of every human life, how do we manage to miss out on it or to avoid answering it today? Well, Crave proposes 5 ways of avoiding the question of the summum bonum. One is very, very easy for our own day and age: diversion. In this day of smartphones and social media and video games and so many apps and so many gadgets, it's really, really very easy to completely avoid the question of the summum bonum and just keep ourselves entertained as long as we want to, or as long as we need to. Propaganda. We live in an age of intense propaganda through TV, movies, media, that keeps telling us what we really need, what we really want. And very often this is focused on materialism. If we only buy the latest thing, if we get the latest gadget, we will finally be happy. If we find this perfect relationship, we will be happy. And so we're constantly given messages that distract us and divert us from seeking the summum bonum. And this ultimately leads to a third point: indifference, that we finally don't care. After we've been distracted long enough and indoctrinated enough by the various messages of the culture, we kind of go, whatever. Whatever just seems to be our answer. We give up on finding happiness, on finding joy, on finding love. So indifference. And this leads to the pursuit of quote-unquote happiness. Not exactly the happiness of the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount, but really a pursuit of pleasures, of fleeting happiness, of instant gratification. And that too is a way of distracting ourselves from the search of the summum bonum. Number 5, well, subjectivism. This is very connected with the other points, perhaps especially point number 2, the propaganda. When we're told often enough and loud enough that there is no such thing as objective truth, that there is no such thing as a loving God who truly cares for us and provides for us and guides us, then we end up with ideologically and doctrinally giving up on this idea of an absolute truth. My truth becomes my truth, your truth is your truth, we all have our truths, and we just seem to do what seems right in our own eyes. And that too is a very effective way of avoiding this question of the ultimate good for our lives. So that is a philosophical introduction to the book of Qohelet of Ecclesiastes. Now let's speak about this title of the book. Why does it have 2 titles? So Qohelet is the Hebrew term. Qohelet, that comes from the Hebrew kahal. Kahal is an assembly, and so Qohelet would mean to assemble or to gather, or the assembler or the gatherer. Some have translated this word as the preacher, because what is a preacher but someone who assembles people, brings people together to listen to him? Perhaps a term for wisdom, or perhaps it's an official office that existed at the time when the book was written. We call the book more commonly Ecclesiastes in English, which comes from the Greek Septuagint Ecclesiastes, which comes from the term, both the Greek and Latin term ecclesia, which means church. And so the book of the church, the book of also of gathering. So Ecclesiastes is basically means the same thing as Qohelet. Qohelet is Hebrew and Ecclesiastes is from the Greek. Not to be confused with the book of Ecclesiasticus, which is found in the Deuterocanonical books or the Apocrypha, and this is otherwise known as the book of Sirach. So Qohelet is the same thing as Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiasticus is the book of Sirach or the book of Ben Sira that we'll study at another date. So who is this Qohelet, and who authored our book? Now, Jewish and Christian tradition have attributed the book to Solomon. Even though Solomon is not mentioned in the text, our author is a certain son of David, king in Jerusalem, or at least he claims to be, as we find in the first verse of the book. This is a man of great wisdom, chapter 1, verse 16, and a composer of Proverbs, chapter 12, verse 9. He is from an upper class. He is a wealthy person, not someone who struggles through life financially. Chapter 2, verse 4 tells us that he is a builder of house and a planter of vineyards. So this too seems to kind of match the character of Solomon as a very wealthy, wise man in the book of Kings. He is an owner of slaves, of herds and flocks, of silver and gold, and has many concubines. Clearly this too matches Solomon's profile. The themes of the book are the vanity of power, pleasure, and possessions. That too seems to match Solomon very well. So these are arguments made for traditional Solomonic authorship of the 10th century BC. This said, there are also two voices in the book, and so the very beginning and the end of the book are a second voice. We have a type of editor or epiloguist, so chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, and then chapter 12, verses 9 to 14, refer to Qohelet in the third person. So it seems like we have this editor who is giving us the two bookends, the beginning and the end of the book. And then Qohelet himself, the preacher, would speak from chapter 1, verse 12 to 12, verse 8. Now, most scholars today would reject Solomonic authorship and claim that the book of Ecclesiastes is much later. It was written in the Post-Exilic period as late as 300 BC. So why do they reject Solomonic authorship, and what are their arguments? So they would say first that, well, the author is anonymous. He never actually claims, or he never names himself as being Solomon, even though many of the traits of the author seem to refer to Solomon. Then they point to chapter 1, verse 16. I have grown and increased in wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. Well, who was reigning over Jerusalem before Solomon? There was his father David, but David conquered Jerusalem. King Saul did not even reign over Jerusalem. So really there was only David who reigned over Jerusalem before Solomon. So who are all who were over Jerusalem before me? Well, as an answer, you could say that maybe Solomon is just referring to the previous Canaanite rulers over Jerusalem. So that's not really a deal breaker. Some would say that the author seems to be helpless in the face of injustices. He expresses frustration that there is so much injustice in the kingdom or in society. So some would say, well, if he's king, why doesn't he just fix it? He has the power to order society rightly and justly. Then you could answer, well, the king is not able to completely transform everything of society. If there's many vices and injustice in society, he can't change the character of all of his subjects. He does speak of the royal office as an outsider in the third person. And some would say there are differences in the language between the language of Ecclesiastes and earlier Hebrew. So they would say that it reflects a late form of Hebrew from the time of the Mishnah. There are some Aramaisms and even Persian loanwords, which apparently would reflect a later period in which the book was written. Some would say there are even affinities with Hellenistic thought, and Israel came in contact with the Greeks much later than the time of Solomon. So what do you think? Are those convincing arguments? Some would say yes, some would say not particularly, especially the question of Aramaisms and Persian loanwords. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was no interaction at all between the Aramaic language and Hebrew much earlier than the exilic period. So what's a book like that doing in the canon? A book that expresses so much skepticism and almost unbelief. So why is it in the canon? We know that the book of Sirach, written around 180 BC, does refer to Ecclesiastes several times. So Sirach seems to have already accepted Ecclesiastes as a sacred book. We know that Hebrew fragments of the book were found at the library in Qumran, dating to about 150 BC. So it seems like it was also considered to be a sanctified book at that time. Nevertheless, there was controversy over the acceptance of the book in the Jewish canon. We know there was a dispute that's recorded in the Mishnah, the earliest compilation of Jewish oral law, where Ecclesiastes was still disputed as, can we really accept this book as a sacred book? Eventually it was, though, both in the Jewish and Christian canon. So the early Christians pretty much unanimously accepted the book of Ecclesiastes in the canon. Fathers such as Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen, and others accepted Ecclesiastes despite its skepticism in the canon. Many would say that the last verse of the book really redeems Qohelet, which says, "All has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." So some would say, thanks for this verse. Thanks to this verse, it was finally accepted in the canon. This verse basically redeems the skepticism that's found in the rest of the book. What kind of a genre is this? Well, some would say it's between a treatise and a collection of sayings and thoughts. So it's really a unique book, a type of philosophical reflection. The style, we see many repetitions in the language. Many perhaps come to mind to you right now. We think of vanity of vanities, toil, work, wise, it's good, there's a certain time to know, the sun chasing the wind, fool, to eat, to profit, what profit is this, death, the just, the wicked, what portion, memory, vexation. So words like this you find repeated very often in the book. Some of the themes: vanity of vanities, all is vanity, including pleasure, toil, riches, wisdom. But there's also a theme of joy. And so even though everything is vanity, we might as well enjoy what we have today. So Qoheleth has been called by some a preacher of joy. He says often there is nothing better than to do this, to enjoy life, to eat and drink and enjoy life. But his methodology is still that of an Israelite sage. He never really considers folly as a viable option. So that's the third theme, that of wisdom. Qoheleth is truly this Israelite sage who, despite his declaration and evaluation of the world as vanity, he still considers wisdom to be superior to folly, and he's never tempted to succumb to the way of folly. Fear of God, our classic wisdom theme. The beginning of wisdom is found in the fear of God. Retribution on the just and the wicked. Now, Ecclesiastes has a lot of problems with retribution, just like Job. Perhaps even more problems than Job, because Job was restored at the end of his life. But Ecclesiastes continues on with his skepticism. Finally, the theme of God, mentioned 40 times as Elohim, never as Yahweh, God who gives life, wisdom, and knowledge, pleasures of life, wealth, and honor. So it is certainly not a secular book, but one that is still permeated with questions about God. Now, according to Kraft, Qoheleth has a syllogism that we're going to try to resolve. This is the syllogism. All toil is under the sun, and all under the sun is vanity. Therefore, all toil is vanity. Is this true? Is this syllogism sound? All toil is under the sun. All under the sun is vanity. Therefore, all toil, everything we do, is vanity. We'll come back to that question a little later. So what are these toils? Well, a toil for Qohelet is any work, everything that we do, all human endeavors and pursuits. And Kreeft identifies 5 major toils in the book of Ecclesiastes. 1, wisdom, philosophy to fill your mind. And you can see that in the book, chapter 1, verse 12. I applied my mind, verse 13, to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the sons of men to be busy with. And so one of our toils is to seek wisdom. Qohelet says, this ends up as vanity. So if wisdom doesn't work, what do we try? Pleasure, hedonism to fill your body. And this is what we find in chapter 2. Come now, I will make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself. The word in Hebrew is actually a test of joy. Let's just have fun while we can. And you can see his tasting and experimenting with all kinds of pleasures of life. How to cheer my body with wine. I made great works, building houses, gardens, parks, pools, male and female slaves, possessions of herds and flocks, and so on. Silver and gold, wealth. And this is actually the next one. Verse 8. The treasure of kings and provinces, and then many concubines. So if pleasure doesn't work, well, try wealth and power, materialism to fill your pocket, and that too, Qohelet finds out that it is vanity. Well then, what about duty, altruism, or honor? So you do ethics to fill your conscience, and this too, Qohelet tries out, as we can see in chapter 4, verses 9 to 11. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. So helping one another, that's another way of trying to find meaning in life. Or 5th, piety, religion to fill your spirit. So our Qohelet is not irreligious, as we said. He does believe in God, and he is also religious, but somehow the practice of his religion is not quite enough. There's something that's missing, so that it belongs to these toils that fail to satisfy, ultimately. Now, there are also 5 vanities, or at least 5, that we may recognize in Qohelet. This is again following Kreeft. So what are all these vanities that are ultimately meaningless? Well, there is the sameness and indifference of all things, as expressed in chapter 9. Death as the certain and final end of life. So no matter what your endeavors, whatever you build, turns up to be like this castle of sand that we saw on the last slide. And so death awaits everyone, poor and rich, wise and foolish, educated and ignorant, and so on, powerful or weak. Time as a cycle of endless repetition. Chapter 3, the beautiful hymn of time. So it seems like everything goes in circles. We go through this endless cycle of the seasons of summer, autumn, winter, spring, and summer again, and it just goes on, and it seems to lack meaning. Number 4, evil as the perennial and unsolvable problem. So this constant question of theodicy that Job struggled with, we see Ecclesiastes also struggle with. Number 5, God as an unknowable mystery. So even though Qohelet does believe in God, well, who is God actually? And does he really care? Is he really present in my life? So once again, we see these 5 vanities very present in Qohelet, but also very relevant to our own day and age. Now, if we go to the structure and outline of Qohelet, it's a very difficult book to outline, with various proposals that have been given by scholars on how to outline this book. This is one possibility. So all scholars agree that there is a prologue, the first 11 verses, spoken or written by the editor. And then we have the first part, chapter 1, verse 12, up until 6, verse 9. And this is really focused on the vanities of life. Vanity of wisdom, of pleasures and toil, seasons, life and death, reflection on the fear of God, and the vanity of wealth and desire. So those first 6 chapters, we hear this constant repetition of vanities, chasing the wind, and so on. The second half, first we have a few transitional verses, and then this second half we might call the mysteries of life. So we see the tone shifts a little bit in this second half. We hear about the better part of wisdom, mysteries of recompense and sin. We hear some practical maxims, how God's ways are inscrutable, universality of death, advantages of wisdom, and so on. So we see these various themes in the second part of the book. And we end with an epilogue, chapter 12, verses 9 to 14. So this is one way of outlining the book. Here are another 2 ways, a little more detailed, following Clifford and Bullock. So how do we resolve Qohelet's syllogism? We're not going to go over the entire text here in this video lecture. All toil is under the sun. All under the sun is vanity. Therefore, all toil is vanity. Well, recall how we determine the soundness of an argument. Is this argument sound? Does it have any ambiguous terms? Does it have any false premise? Or does it contain a logical fallacy? Well, in this case, there are no ambiguous terms. They're pretty simple. There's also no logical fallacies, so the argument holds together. But the problem is that both premises are false. In other words, is all toil really under the sun? And therefore, is all under the sun really vanity? So how do we answer Qohelet's lament? Is there a toil that is not under the sun? Well, we find that in the last 2 verses of the book. Fear God and keep his commandments. There's a certain spiritual inner dimension in keeping God's commandments that goes beyond what is seen under the sun in the spiritual realm. The other one is the kingdom of heaven, and this is what Jesus will come to reveal, that observing the commandments and following God allows us to tap in this different mystery, the mystery of God's presence and God's love. And this answers the second question, is anything under the sun that is not vanity? And this is truly the answer. Love is not vanity. Loving God and loving one another. And so this is the ultimate answer to Qohelet's syllogism. A couple of quotes to conclude this introduction to Ecclesiastes. Some have called Qohelet the most staggering messianic prophecy to appear in the Old Testament. What do we mean by that? We mean this, that the Old Testament was here on the point of running itself to death. Behind this total nothing, from a human point of view, the only possible help was the new creature of the New Testament. In other words, Qohelet tries to find an answer to the problem of retribution. If you do good, you will be blessed. If you do bad, you will be cursed. But sometimes, even if you do good, you find that you don't find all the answers. You can still encounter this existential angst, depression, sadness, loss, and so on. And so this shows that when we remain in this realm, the realm of this world, we find that there are some serious limitations to finding a real meaning to life. And the solution, according to this quote, was the new creature of the New Testament. In other words, when Christ comes, he comes and opens the reality of eternal life. And here is from the great classic of Christian literature, The Imitation of Christ. Thomas à Kempis tells us, "Vanity of vanities, and all is vanity, unless we serve God and love him with our whole heart. Oh, this is the highest and safest wisdom, that by contempt of the world we endeavor to please God." And so this concludes our study of Qohelet, bringing us to the limitations of retribution in the Old Testament and anticipating this toil and this reality that is not just under the sun, but exists forever with God, and that is the love of God. And we will talk more about love when we turn to the Song of Songs. That's all for today. See you next time.